I'm Lexi Newkirch. I work for the Rocky Mountain Research Station as a science delivery specialist based in Fort Collins, Colorado. And after my short intro today, we will hear presentations and stories from our panelists, followed by a panel discussion and a Q&A with all of you. So this Wildlife and Fire in the Southwest workshop and webinar series has been created by a very large team of partners, including Southwest Fire Science Consortium, USDA Forest Service Region 3, Rocky Mountain Research Station, and all of the agencies and groups whose logos are listed on the screen here. This group created a year-long series of workshops, webinars, and reports to inform wildlife outcomes in the face of wildfire. This series is intended to help researchers and practitioners across disciplines of wildfire and wildlife to exchange ideas, tools, and lessons for working within the rapid pace and scale of fire management in the Southwest. Each of the webinars in our series will focus on a topic that was identified by our 200 virtual workshop participants as something that they wanted to hear more about and discuss in greater detail. If you were unable to attend that kickoff workshop in January, I will put the link to the recordings in the chat for you. We've heard some important questions already that will guide the beginning of our discussion today, but if you have additional questions and comments throughout any of the presentations today, or as we get into the discussion, please put them into the chat box at any time. Also, a quick note, if you are a member of the media or with a congressional office, I ask you to coordinate any information requests with the Rocky Mountain Research Station Public and Legislative Affairs Office, and I'll also add their information into the chat as soon as I'm done here. So again, thank you for attending today, and thank you to all of our panelists. I also want to acknowledge and thank Rachel Bean and Eitan Krasilovsky, who have been working behind the scenes on this webinar to keep us rolling smoothly. We are recording this webinar today, so if you'd like to watch the webinar again or to share it with a colleague who couldn't attend today, it will be posted on the RMRS webinar page, and I'll drop that link into the chat too. All right, so let's get into our panel today. Our panelists are Jamie Sanderlin, a quantitative vertebrate ecologist with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, Morgan Tingley, an associate professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of California, Los Angeles, and Jonathan Grassmick, Director of Ranch Properties for the Pueblo of Sandia. I'm looking forward to hearing from each of them and getting into our panel discussion. I'm going to stop sharing my slides now, and then I'll introduce our first speaker. All right, Jamie is up first, and Jamie is a quantitative vertebrate ecologist in the Wildlife Ecology Research Program with the USDA Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station in Flagstaff, Arizona. Her current research includes evaluating disturbance effects on bird and small mammal communities and improving inference of species for management decisions via modeling advancements like data integration models and sampling advancements like optimal sampling designs, bioacoustics, community/citizen science with wildlife monitoring data, excuse me. All right, Jamie, everything looks good on my end, so I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. So thank you, Lexi, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for your attention today. So the theme of what I will be presenting is centered around finding common ground. So we are all coming from diverse backgrounds and experiences. And how do we leverage shared information across individuals for the conservation and management of wildlife and fire in the Southwest? Today, I will be sharing results from the pre-workshop survey from the initial kickoff workshops in January to help set the stage for the webinar series over the next several months on behalf of the research team and the planning committee. So first of all, our research team initiated these conversations and workshops to help inform our research merging fire regimes, climate, and topography with bird and vegetation data within Mexico and the US borderlands region. So we and others want to know how to make our research questions and products of maximum use to managers in the field, and we need your guidance to do that. So the planning committee, along with the research team, developed a suite of pre-workshop survey questions to help guide learning opportunities for this year. But before sharing these results, I'd like to share a story where finding common ground led to valuable information about wildfire effects on wildlife. So in 2011, the Horseshoe 2 fire perimeter included the entire Chiricahua mountain range and received a lot of media attention at the time. And the Chiricahua Mountains, for those of you not familiar, is in the southeastern part of Arizona, the United States. And there was also at the time a lot of concern from local citizens that are dependent on ecotourism in this area. So the Friends of Cave Creek Canyon, which is a nonprofit organization, approached Rocky Mountain Research Station wondering about the status of bird communities in the Chiricahuas. And a lot of the folks in this community lead bird tours, and so they were really interested about what's going on with fire. And they were also familiar with our original study in the 1990s. So with our shared interest in evaluating wildfire effects on birds, we entered into a community science partnership to monitor birds for a few years post-wildfire to compare to the original study. So we did expect to see areas that had high severity, like this picture, where you see few live trees or plants. But we also expected to see pockets of live trees, you can see up here in the upper left, as per usual, and mixed severity fires. And we also saw areas that reburned and had fairly clear understories, if you see the picture on the bottom left. And we saw areas with moderate to low severity with intact forest structure, so up on the upper right. And we even saw areas that had low severity. So on the bottom right, so it's hard to see even effects of fire on the ground with those areas. And we also saw evidence of regrowth from oak resprouting in high severity areas and water resources. And much to the delight of our volunteers at Friends of Cave Creek Canyon, we detected bird species that tend to only be found in wildfire areas like the buff-breasted flycatcher and other woodpecker species. So without this unique partnership and common interest in discovering how the wildfire affected birds in this mountain range, we would not have monitored this biodiversity hotspot and learned more about wildfire effects in this region and what that means for ecotourism. So now I'd like to shift over to, what we've learned from the pre-workshop survey responses. And we did have over 500 responses and had 13 questions that covered who, where, what experience folks had, what information is needed for work on the ground, and then different learning opportunities. So most respondents were from the U.S. Forest Service with primary professional roles as land managers and program managers. And most survey respondents have main fields of expertise in wildlife or wildlife habitat for the U.S. Forest Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There were also a high percentage of folks with forest or vegetation management expertise, especially in the U.S. Forest Service. Most respondents from the survey had greater than 15 years of experience in their field. And we also learned that most survey respondents work in coniferous forest, but also work in riparian systems, pinyon juniper woodland, grasslands, and oak woodland and pine oak systems. So lots of diversity in systems out there. And then we learned that survey respondents regularly had experience with forest collaborative participation and research wildlife or habitat and manage wildlife or habitat. So lots of common ground at this point. So moving over to learning objectives, most respondents would like to learn about proactive management versus being reactive increasing the pace and scale of treatments and prescribed fire without compromising wildfire objectives, and monitoring information. So we are using these responses to populate our future webinar topics. And we're already planning, on the monitoring side with the monitoring topics. So a lot of sources are being used to inform work and make decisions, like journals and technical papers, webinars, monitoring data. So this is really informative to know what kind of research projects can take on, and thinking about different audiences and reaching different folks in the field. So a lot of information sources are being used. All right, so most survey respondents need information about long-term studies, temporal change monitoring, and implementation monitoring. So this aligns with the research team goals with the long-term studies and temporal change monitoring. So that's really exciting to know that we're on the right track here. So finally, again, how are we using this information? So first, we're informing topics for the webinar series with shared learning opportunities. Second, we're learning about what the best information sources to target with research products that are useful for decision making. And finally, what information and research is most needed, and what are the gaps in information going forward. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and especially for those of you that participated in the pre-workshop survey and provided feedback. This is really valuable, and looking forward to engaging through the months to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. It's always great to see survey results presented when often they're just filled out and you're not sure exactly what happened. So I'm really glad we're able to share exactly what we found with the people who hopefully were able to participate in that survey. So next up, we are going to have a story and presentation from Morgan Tingley. Morgan is an associate professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of California, Los Angeles. He holds a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and an MSc from Oxford University. His research focuses on the various ways that birds respond to anthropogenic disturbance, including climate change and wildfire. His collaborative work with the Institute for Bird Populations on bird response to fire has been recognized by a Wings Across the Americas Conservation Award from the Forest Service. All right, thank you, Morgan. Everything looks good, so I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. And you can hear me, yeah? All right, great. Thanks, Lexi. So yeah, I'm gonna tell you a story that kind of is trying to summarize maybe like 14 years of research in this field that I've been working on with across a variety of institutions, and working primarily with the Forest Service and the Institute for Bird Populations, which is a conservation NGO based here out of Northern California. And this focus of this work really begins with a bird species that I love a lot and have worked a lot on, called the black-backed woodpecker, which I'm sure is actually familiar to many of you in the audience. The black-backed woodpecker has been described as the most fire-dependent or fire-reliant bird in North America. Well, at least Western North America. The red-cockaded woodpecker would probably win that award for the continent as a whole. But here in Western North America, in California and other states, black-backed woodpeckers are really found predominantly in recently burned forests. And they've become to sort of a signal of sort of healthy post-fire forests, and used in many cases as an indicator species for management of what we should be looking for in sort of bird communities that indicate sort of healthy, diverse burned forests. And so a lot of my research has been sort of focusing on the ecology, distribution, and abundance of this species in the Sierra Nevada of California, and trying to understand, well, why is this species so fire reliant? And what are the characteristics of fires that really make it specialize in this? And a lot of that story sort of depends on like, well, why are they here and why are they not in other places? A lot of it has to do, of course, with food. So here's a blackback woodpecker at its nest cavity in a burned tree. It's right. This is maybe like a 4 or 5 years after fire. The tree has already lost all of its bark. There's a nice cavity, and you can see this adult female woodpecker bringing this giant grub to feed her youngster. And this grub is a particular grub of a type of wood-boring beetle, of which there's a variety of different species that colonize these trees within months, weeks to months after a fire has passed through an area and the tree is starting to die. And so these wood-boring beetles, they drill into the wood, they leave their eggs, and then for the next 5 to 8 years or so, there's all sorts of these giant grubs feeding. And so obviously you can see just by the scale of this grub in this photo, the huge actually food intake value that this particular insect or species of insect have as a food source, which is why both blackback woodpeckers and a variety of other woodpeckers really, really like post-fire areas. Here in California, with the Forest Service, we've been surveying them for a number of years. This is just data from our monitoring program that started in 2009, and this is just data through 2016. But if I plotted this through 2023, it looks pretty much the same. Sort of the proportion of occupied sites and post-fire forests in California, it varies a little bit from year to year, but the state population seems to be overall quite stable. But this is kind of like on averaging across all fires that we're surveying within fires that have burned within 10 years. And if we actually look at any specific fire and look to see the trajectory of population over time, it's pretty steep. So if you go in 1 year after a fire, maybe 60 to 80% of the burned forest in that area is going to be occupied, and you have sort of generally high occupancy of fires through about 4 years after fire. And then about 4 years after fire, you start to see this quite steep decline, such that by 10 years after fire, there's only about 30% of the fire that potentially remains occupied. And as we extend that timeline farther to like 15 years or 20 years, you really start to see the species essentially disappear from these burned landscapes, even though you and I might go into them and they still look like post-fire burned landscapes. And so a lot of the research that I've been working on has been trying to understand, well, what is behind this pattern and what is exactly going on? And one of the things that we sort of started to hypothesize from work was we went into fires of different ages and we caught blackback woodpeckers and we held them in our hands, and using their feather patterns of growth and patternation, we were able to actually age them into age classes. And one of the things we found was that older fires, that is to say 5 to 8 years after fire, had older birds, and younger fires, like 1 to 2 years, had really young birds, like 1 to 2 years old. And so there seemed to be this pattern, really quite strong linear pattern between fire age and age of birds, indicating that when new fires are emerging, it's not old birds that are going into them, but actually new birds. And so thus if we want to understand the distribution patterns of the species on the landscape, we should be looking at juveniles and following and seeing where they go. So this started a multi-year study working with one of my PhD students, who's the one at the top of the ladder here, Andrew Stillman, who's now a research associate at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And Andrew got to basically go into all these post-fire forests and set up a ladder that he could use to access woodpecker nests without allowing that ladder to actually touch the tree for safety reasons, because of course these are dead or dying trees that could fall down at any moment. And so he would go and he'd find these nests, and he would drill into them about 1 to 2 days before the fledglings were ready to leave the nest, and he'd pull them out and he'd put radio transmitters on them. And so you can see here on the left, there's a photo of a juvenile. This is a bird that has just left the nest, maybe in the last week or so. And you can see the nice radio antenna sticking out of its butt, off of its back. And its father is there on the right. And so we can then take these radio tagged juveniles and follow them for their first year of life. It starts out sort of tracking them on foot, seeing what trees they use, what resources they use, and eventually to see where they go 1 year later, we have to fly around in planes, attaching radio transmitters to small planes, looking for them across the landscape so we can see, well, where do they go? Where do these juvenile woodpeckers go? And so to go through this kind of quickly, we ended up tracking about 20 different juvenile woodpeckers from a variety of different nests from different fires. And what we found was that 78% of those woodpeckers, those juvenile woodpeckers, would actually settle the next year. And usually that's the year they start breeding. So they would establish territories and start breeding the next year. 78% of them would settle in other burned forests. Sometimes it was the same, it was the natal fire that they were born in, but in many cases, they actually went from one fire to another fire. And we did like a whole landscape sort of comparison to see what we'd expect at random. And at random, we'd only expect if they weren't selecting for fires, they were just going across the landscape and randomly settling places, we'd expect about 10% to settle into fires. So clearly that with about almost 80% of them settling in fires, it's evidence that they're actually selecting for fires across the landscape. And this figure just shows like one example of a bird. All these colored points are tracking points. So a bird was born in one fire, and these dark outlines are different fires on the landscape. So it was born in this one fire and spent the fall or spent the late summer kind of bopping around. It's more or less where it was born. By the fall, when we found it in November of its first year of life, it had moved about 15 kilometers to a different fire. And then the following May, it had moved to a third fire where it had set up a territory. And so not only did we find evidence that they are selecting for fires across the landscape, but also they are moving selectively to fires that are younger than the fire they were born in. And so this is just a plot of the age of fire for the fires they were born in versus the age of fires that they ended up settling in. And we only had one bird that went to an older fire that left a 5-year-old fire and ended up an 11-year-old fire. And every single one of the other birds that we found, for the most part, went to a fire, moved to a fire that was either the same age or younger, in many cases, many years younger. So there's all these birds that left 7-year fires and moved to 1-year fires. So we're seeing this pattern that they're moving across the landscape. They're looking for fire, and they're looking for fires that are younger and are essentially fresh, open territories, and potentially lots of food for them. Now, when I first started working with the Institute for Bird Populations and the Forest Service on fires, one of like sort of the really big events that sort of catalyzed a lot of research was the Rim Fire, which burned in August 2013 in the Sierra Nevadas, including parts of Yosemite National Park and other national forests. And Rim at the time was the largest fire that had ever burned that we know of in the Sierra Nevada. Of course, now it's like the 4th largest, but it was 250,000 acres. And it was this huge a lot of resources were put into, a lot of ecologists flooded there to see what would happen after a fire this big. And so we spent sort of 2 summers after the Rim Fire had burned going in expecting to find tons and tons of blackback woodpeckers. And instead, what we found was like almost no blackback woodpeckers. Every single one, this is the Rim Fire, 250,000 acres. Every single one of these circles is a survey point that we did for blackback woodpeckers. And you can see that there's only 6 of them that are filled in. So across the entire survey part of the fire that we surveyed, we found only 6 blackback woodpecker territories. And just to compare this we surveyed another fire simultaneously that was 1 to 2 years old. That was only 92,000 acres. This is the Berry Point Fire on the California-Oregon border. And in this section of the fire, we actually had 80 individuals. So 80 versus 6, even though Rim was this massive fire that had all this territory that should be good, we found almost no woodpeckers there. And so this really sort of led to this question of like, what is going on? Why are we not finding woodpeckers in this? And this brought us to a concept that was really just starting to come into America at the time, that really had been developed by the Australians, a concept called pyrodiversity. And pyrodiversity, I will just generally define as the temporal or structural diversity of fire. And I like to depict this again through the Rim Fire. And so we have the Rim Fire here, but now what I'm showing you is actually a pattern. So basically a map showing the pattern of burned expansion of this fire day by day. So it was started on August 17th at this little pink spot. And then on different days it burned. And you can see that on the 21st of August and the 22nd of August, it burned massive amounts. So it was wind fueled, it was climate fueled, and of course it was fuel fueled. But it just blew up and created, and this is now a pattern we see sort of replicated in a lot of these now quote unquote mega fires, that we have these certain days where the fire just expands massively. The pattern and the timing with which these fires burn also then can be translated almost directly to burn severity. So this is now NDVI. and then would be a basal area loss or burn severity map. And you can see that all of these bright red areas where 75 to 100% of the basal area, the trees are lost, those translate very directly to those days in which the fire was just burning like very, very hot, very, very quickly and expanding in large amounts. And so the idea of pyrodiversity says that we can take a map like this and we can look within the fire at areas where there's low pyrodiversity or higher pyrodiversity. So low pyrodiversity would be these areas where it's almost all red or all green, where you don't have a diversity of burn severities within the fire. And high pyrodiversity would be these areas that are circled here that actually have a large variation in high severity and low severity fire. Now, I've been working with a variety of researchers, some of whom are in the audience. But when I first started working with this, I was working with a now Forest Service research scientist, Gavin Jones, where we did a sort of a global review of people who'd studied biodiversity and related it to the idea of biodiversity. Ask the question, in areas where we have greater biodiversity, do we also have more species? And so people have been studying this a lot in Australia, and every so often in some bit in California, in a few other places around the world. It's a growing type of hypothesis and a growing type of test. And certainly we see plenty of evidence for it around the world, that there is evidence for sort of biodiversity relationships, particularly and actually quite strongly in these landscapes with a lot of structural heterogeneity and structural complexity, like forests and woodlands. One of our ideas for why this happens and where this hypothesis comes from is the idea just of habitat of resource partitioning, right? And so we can have a species that might be their niche is a intact low severity burn forest, or species that their niche would be a high severity forest. And so we might find, say, a western tanager in this area where there's a lot of live trees left, and a Lewis's woodpecker in this area where there's almost no live trees left. And so if we go into a pyrodiverse area where you have both of these different distinct habitats, then you actually might get both species. But one of the things that's really been interesting is studying how biodiversity relates not just sort of globally, sort of regionally to sort of resource partitioning and biodiversity, but also how individual species can respond in terms of biodiversity as well. And so this comes back to things that we discovered out of our tracking data, where we started to actually see really, really interesting patterns when we looked at the resource use and the habitat use of the fledgling versus adult blackback woodpeckers. And so we found that actually, even though they would be inhabiting the same fire and be within, say, 200, 500, a kilometer of each other, they used radically different areas. And so for one thing, they actually would use the edges of burn severity patches. And so these maps here of these different colors track to low, medium, or high severity. And you can see all these black points, which are tracking points of individuals, are clustered on those edges. But you can also see that they're using different habitats. So these fledglings are mostly in these gray areas or low severity fire, and the adults are primarily in the red areas or high severity fire. And this is, of course, during a stage when the juveniles are still primarily dependent on their parents for food. But juveniles are staying where there's live trees. For the most part, they're just hiding up in the forests. And the adults are actually in these areas where there is almost no live trees left, and there's high severity. And so our understanding of why this is, why the juveniles are all in those live trees, has to do with basically them staying safe and trying to stay alive. And so we did survival analyses, and we found that juveniles that actually spent their time in low severity or unburned forest had a much, much higher probability of survival than the ones who spent their time in high burn severity forests. The ones that basically were out in these open landscapes where all of the trees were dead, they just got eaten by avian predators. And so I have a photo here of actually a place where we found one of our radio transmitters of a baby blackback woodpecker. This is a nest of a western screech owl, and even screech owls that are about the same size as a blackback woodpecker would predate these babies. They just were cumbersome and not particularly well coordinated, and every different type of bird would eat them. And so we understand then this biodiversity relationship as is a relationship of the landscape of fear. So this is demonstrating that even within a species like the blackback woodpecker that is highly specialized for living in post-fire landscapes, they will use actually different habitats across these different ages, where the juveniles that are just trying to live and survive will go into the dense forest where it's safe, where the adults will actually be out into this very, very dangerous landscape, but a landscape that of course also has all of the food. And so that's why they stick to the edges, leading to this understanding about how pyrodiversity leads to actually this species actually inhabiting the more pyrodiverse landscapes than in less pyrodiverse landscapes. And all of this means in California and other parts of the West that we're looking at a world with greater amounts of megafires and greater amount of habitat loss. And so this has led us to conclude that, you know, even these types of these megafires that we imagine should be giving lots of habitat are actually imperiling these fire-loving birds. So I'll stop there, but I'm looking forward to the panel.
Thank you, Morgan. That was very interesting. Also looking forward to the panel and all the questions that I have for you. Next up, we're going to hear from Jonathan Grassmick. Jonathan has degrees in environmental science and forestry from Stephen F. Austin State University. He has been working in the fields of wildlife habitat management and fire ecology for 19 years in New Mexico and has been managing the Pueblo of Sandias ranch properties in northern New Mexico for the past 8 years. Current projects include forest thinning, riparian restoration, and a wildlife migration corridor / fuel break that connects the Valle Vidal on the Carson National Forest with the Moreno Valley, two of the premier high elevation grassland habitats in New Mexico. All right, Jonathan, it looks like you are just getting set up still. Give you just another second. No rush.
Can you see my screen?
We see your document viewer. We don't see your presentation yet.
Got it. It shows that I'm sharing my screen.
Maybe try closing out the screens that might be in front of your presentation there.
Can you see it yet?
Not yet.
Hmm.
Well, then I can also just share this for you too. And you can just let me know when you would like to go to the next screen. How does that work?
Let me see this.
Oh, there it is. Yep.
It is. Okay.
All right. Put it into presentation mode and then it should be good to go.
All right. Sorry about that.
All good.
Thank you, Lexi, and thank you, Morgan and Jamie, for your presentations. I think what Morgan was discussing actually leads nicely into what I want to talk about, which is edge effect. And the way I'd like to begin is just talking about the project that I'm working on right now, which is a corridor that is going to connect the Valle Vidal, which is a grassland up here with the Moreno Valley, which is a grassland to the south. And so we are creating a corridor that converts the forest to a grassland that connects those two. And so what I want to do is go through some of the game camera pictures from this project and discuss what the differences are and some of the things that we can learn from those. So the first camera that we're going to look at is down here in phase 1. This project is 9 phases. So it goes from phase 1, which is about at 9,000 feet, all the way up to phase 9, which is actually on the Valle Vidal, which is part of the Carson National Forest. And so it goes up to about 10,000 feet. So it's 3 miles long and about 600 feet wide on average. And so the idea is to, in some ways, replicate what past fire regimes would have been, but also to allow us to use controlled fire in the future to burn more safely and bring fire back to the landscape. I mentioned that first camera is going to be down here. The second one is going to be up here on the tree line. So phase one, this was actually done in the what you see in the foreground there was done in 2019. And as you can see, 2 years later, you still see quite a bit of that, the chips from the mastication that was done. But this was all forest, similar to what's in the background there. And it's now in the process of revegetation. So now you can see phase two in the background. That was done 2 years later in 2021. And we piled the slash on the slopes in windrows perpendicular to the slope for erosion control. And you can see we're starting a controlled burn actually in this phase one. It's a little bit difficult to see, but the fire, we did do a broadcast burn through here, and it didn't burn like it would normally through, I think, just grass. So it was a little patchy, but we did get a fire to run through that that masticated chip area. So now you can see as we move forward, you know, we're starting to see animals utilize this corridor. And then the following year, you can start to see some of the revegetation after the burn, and you'll start to see that accelerate a little bit. We did lose some trees that were left. We did lose due to windfall. We were expecting that. You can see a lonely deer there, some turkeys utilizing it. You can start to see the re-veg now in the foreground. You can start to see some of the re-veg on the slope in the background, and the foreground is really taking off now. More turkeys. And now in this picture, you can see that we're, I guess I can go back one. You can see that we actually have burned those piles in the background now on the slopes. And we are going to do some hand re-veg on those burn scars. We burned piles. You can see those, we burned some more piles in the background there. As you can see us progressing, you can see the changes in the vegetation after the burn. And you can see as we progress, kind of the wildlife that are utilizing this. And so this was the most recent picture from this camera. So then we go to the camera in phase 5 of the project. Now, keep in mind that the pictures that I just showed were over about a 2.5 year span. The pictures that we're going to be looking at now are over about a 5-month span. So we used mechanical means to remove the trees. You can see wildlife starting to utilize this area right away. This isn't necessarily wildlife, but these guys are pretty wild. You can see there's a coyote down here in the bottom right. And so what we see is quite a different story as far as the wildlife that utilizes this area. We have the mechanical removal of this vegetation, but in some ways that does replicate the effects of a fire. And so I like this picture because I think of this coyote using the forest as the cafeteria, and he's probably taking his rabbit or whatever he has in his mouth up to that sunny slope to eat. But then when you're talking about different wildlife species, now we have a bull elk who's licking his lips after he probably just got through feeding out in the open on the in the meadow, and now he's going into the forest to bed down. And so what our goal is to remove a lot of this fuel so that when we come back and do some broadcast burns in the future, we have removed a lot of the fuel that is accumulated and we can burn more safely. I want to point out that he starts this fire at about 10:02. By 10:08, it's almost completely engulfed. 10:26. So this is just another way that we have removed the fuel from this area so that when we come back to burn in the future, a broadcast burn, now we're able to do so in a much safer manner. In the future, we plan on coming into these forests adjacent to the newly created corridor and doing some hand thinning and removing the ladder fuels and then doing broadcast burns in the forest understory. And then we will burn through the forest understory and then into the corridor. And in that way, try to bring fire back to the landscape in a way that is going to be much safer, and the public will be not so nervous, I guess, about some of these efforts to try to bring fire back to the landscape. But I guess just to finish up, what I want to point out is kind of the difference in wildlife utilization. I know it's anecdotal, but in the first set of pictures, we saw a lot of elk, a few turkeys, but really mostly elk were utilizing that wide open area in the middle. And now when we bring the view more to the forest edge between the opening and the forest, we see a lot more utilization by, there's more deer, there are predators. And what I'm expecting in the future is that this camera, as it progresses, will capture even a greater diversity of wildlife. So that first set of pictures was a lot of, it was over 2.5 years. So, it really captured a pretty good sample of the type of wildlife that was utilizing that. And then these last set of pictures captured just 5 months. And I think you can see quite a bit more diversity. So those are the kinds of things that we're working on out here on this project. And I think that we're showing really good results. And I expect this camera to show even more diversity in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. So that concludes our presentation portion of today. And now we're going to open it up for questions for all three of our presenters today, our panelists. So I'll have Jamie, Morgan, and Jonathan all turn your cameras back on. I've got a couple questions coming in to the chat box, and I welcome anyone to keep putting any questions you have or comments as well into that chat box. I'm going to read them out, and then our panel can answer them here. Also, there's going to be the ability for you to unmute yourself now. So after I read a couple of these questions, I'm going to offer that opportunity if anyone would like to just come on their mic or turn on their camera and ask a question kind of more in person as well. Thank you all. I see you, Jamie and Morgan. But our first questions, we're going to start with a couple for Jonathan that just rolled in. For Jonathan, did any type of seeding occur for veg establishment in thinned areas first presented?
Yes, we used a native seed mix to come back in, and what we found was seeding in some of those areas that where there was mastication occurred. What you ended up with was a situation where you had kind of a lattice of these wood fibers that would prevent germination of seeds. And so the way to get around that was to basically rough up that top layer before you seed. And when you dig down a little bit into some of those chip beds that are a couple years old, you see some really good, it's breaking down quite well, but without roughing up that top layer, you really aren't able to get good seed to soil contact. And so you really need to, we experimented a lot with different methods, and that's what really worked well for us.
Awesome, thank you. And I will ask you one more short question, Jonathan. Regarding thinning and prescribed fire, how much of the work is taking place on forest and off forest?
Meaning like national forest or just forest in general? Just
feel free to clarify in the chat, but maybe we can just
I think
say both.
if it's just forest in general, you know, where the goal is to be able to burn between existing roads, and so we the corridor itself, the grassland part of it, we're obviously going to be burning through that, but then we're going to be thinning the forest adjacent to that corridor to existing roads, sometimes logging roads, sometimes roads that we use fairly often. But the idea is to not add more roads to the landscape. So we'll try to go out to existing roads so that we can use those roads as our fire lines.
Thank you. And then how about national forest?
Well, this is all private land. So I'm working with the Carson National Forest to do projects together across boundaries. So they are going to be working on completing that final stage of the corridor on the Via Vidal. And then they're going to be doing some thinning on the property line as well. And we're going to be doing some collaboration burning between the two properties.
Thank you. All right, I've got a question about birds from Morgan. Given the complex response of the birds following the fire, how can managers know which areas to prioritize for diversity and like which areas would be a lower diversity or lower priority?
Yeah, thanks, Lexi. We've been working with Forest Service managers in California for probably about over 10 or 12 years, trying to help, particularly like in the first year after fire, right? Where to prioritize to maintain habitat, where to do post-fire management, reseeding, planting, all sorts of different types of prioritization. And you know, when one of the species like that a lot of people are worried about is things like the black-backed woodpecker, and like where can we take down, you know, where are these patches of habitat going to be mostly used for them? And so going back to the rim fire starting in 2014, we started to develop basically models that we could use that would actually estimate sort of predicted abundance on landscapes based off of all of the data we have. So we could say, okay, well, 9 months after a fire, the satellites have flown over, we've been able to get pretty much really good remotely sensed data, and we can use that to make estimates of where birds are going to be 5 years in the future, and use that information to start to actually make really informed decisions about particularly patches to manage or not. Can I share my screen again? Am I allowed to? I have,
Sure.
Let's see. Yeah, so we actually, this is through, we got some funding from the Joint Fire Science Program to actually come up with sort of a decision support tool for blackback woodpecker management that is widely available now. So this is used as a type of technology called a R Shiny app, which is basically just a web app where there's a lot of computer modeling going on behind the scenes. But so this is a website anyone can go to. It's hosted by the Institute for Bird Populations. And all it requires of a manager is to sort of upload a little bit of data. So upload a burn severity layer, a sort of a perimeter of interest, like a fire polygon or a set of specific polygons, and then just put in like a little bit of information about the fire, like whether or not you are interested in predictions 2 years after fire or 10 years after fire, and when the fire occurred, and things like that. And then what it gives out is it gives out something like this thing on the right. And so this black outline is the full outline of a particular fire, and it comes up with a map of the predicted density of blackback woodpeckers and pairs per acre. And we've done this primarily for blackback woodpeckers because that's a really important management species here in California, but you could do it for lots of other birds as well. We have the data for it. And then you could start to actually take out particular polygons like these ones in red and start to actually just sum them up and calculate what sort of the density would be in these different areas. And so you can start to actually make really specific trade-offs about, well, do we do really intensive management this way, this area, or do we retain the forest in this other area in order to try and actually sort of use the information that we have? Because, you know, this is all based off, this doesn't require anyone actually going into the fires after they occurred. This is purely based off of essentially satellite derived data. And so it means that we can actually sort of use everything we've learned over the last 15 years to make really quick decisions to help managers as much as possible.
Awesome, thank you. And asking for the URL of your website in the chat. If you don't mind just dropping that in, that would be awesome.
Definitely, I will definitely put it in. If you try and plug stuff into it and use it, like if 70 people tried to do it all at once, the app would crash. So, but I will put it in the chat, and you can save it and you can go to it on another day when the app is less likely to crash, because it does take a lot of computing power.
Thank you so much, and good to know. Not all at once. I've got a couple more questions from the chat for Jonathan. So what kind of usage patterns by wildlife were out in the interior portions of the created openings, less than 300 or so feet from the edge of the opening versus, or sorry, greater than 300 feet or so from the edge of the opening versus near the ecotones or edges of the opening? Let me know if I need to repeat that. I stumbled over it a bit.
No worries, I think I got it. So I think that what the game cameras are showing is that you're getting a lot more use by predators on the edges, and you're getting a lot more use by large ungulates like elk in the interior. One of the interior of the corridor. One of the goals of this corridor project is to have a migration path for high elevation pronghorn. There have been pronghorn in the area, and I believe that it's they are there because they used to migrate up to these high elevation areas in greater numbers, but because of changing fire regimes, those corridors no longer exist like they used to. So I'm expecting in the future to see more species like pronghorn and elk in the interior of the corridor area, and then turkeys, more predators like bobcats, bears that stick to the edges.
Thank you. And for project funding, are these corridors justified as wildlife corridors or fuel breaks, possibly on the WUI?
This is actually funded. We're utilizing multiple funding sources for this, and some are more geared toward the wildlife aspect and some are more geared toward the wildfire mitigation.
Thank you. I have another question for possibly all three of you, but Jamie in the beginning talked about kind of finding this common ground, especially when there's a lot of potential for conflict between people on the wildlife side versus the fire side, or general public having some fear around fire itself. So I'm curious, Jonathan, especially how you communicated about this project and if you ran into any issues that really were serving as roadblocks and how you got around those.
You know, part of this funding was with National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So they do a public hearing before these projects kick off, and so you know we did a lot of interaction with the public on this project, particularly, but really we didn't get a whole lot of pushback. I think one of the big reasons is because people are really hyper aware of the danger from these catastrophic fires that have been occurring with greater frequency. You know, we just had the largest fire in state history here in New Mexico a couple of years ago, the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire. And so with these fires, a couple of years before that, we had the Ute Park fire, which was fairly close to this area. And I think the public is ready to engage in some of these projects and are much less likely to complain about them as they were just a few years ago.
Thanks. And Morgan, in a related kind of way, when you are collecting your data and working with forests to get into the fires and share what you're finding, are you finding any pushback from certain groups or any people that expected another outcome that you are then kind of challenging their beliefs that they've held?
I mean, the work, like every part of the work that I've described has been in very close collaboration with the Forest Service, and in many cases funded by the Forest Service. And so like the Forest Service, right, is great. It's great to work with. And you know, I push back, right? Fire gets people really passionate, and a lot of people have really specific expectations. You know, on the science side, like we like put on our science hats and we say we're scientists, we're impartial, we're just like letting the data tell us what it is. And so, you know, as a scientist, I usually like have that defense that I can run behind and say it's not, you know, it's not my ideas. It's just what the data show. But it's, you know, it is interesting. Like, you know, with blackback woodpeckers, like they were a species that there was a federal listing petition for them for the Endangered Species Act, and there was also a state listing petition under California. Neither of those passed, but there was and continues to be a lot of really passionate rhetoric around like just where the species is and where it is not and what it requires and what it does not. You know, our work relating blackback woodpecker density to pyrodiversity, showing that the juveniles actually really like unburned forest, kind of flew in the face of a lot of, you know, decades of dogma that the species really just needed large, extensive stands of high severity fire. And that if you had those high severity fire stands, then you'd find the woodpeckers. And you do, but you find them on the edges. You don't find them in the centers. And you know, I think that's like that leads to much greater depth and obviously better management of species, because that's what we care about. But it does mean you have to go out and communicate what you're finding and the reasons for it really well, because otherwise a lot of people might have sort of knee-jerk expectations about what a species wants or what a species needs that isn't necessarily up to date with the current findings of science.
Thank you. Jamie, do you have anything along those lines to add, especially from your story that you shared all the way in the very beginning of this webinar?
Yeah, I'd like to add on more about the importance of bringing folks out into the field, and because you can get a very different perspective of what's going on the ground with media stories versus, you know, what's actually happening on the ground. And we saw it right before our eyes with the partner organization that we were working with, that there was just this complete shift about what wildfire does for the bird communities, and in turn, ecotourism in the area. So I think that is one way to find common ground, is get outside, get on the ground to find that common ground. Sometimes it's in meetings and sharing stories, but yeah, there's ways.
Thank you. I've got a couple more questions in the chat. Everyone, please feel free to keep adding, but I'm also going to open up this space and I'll just wait and be quiet for a moment. If anyone wants to unmute or come on camera and ask a question or share their own story with the group here. No takers right now, but I'll offer that up again. So if you're still thinking about it, there's another chance. For now, I'm going to ask a question from Jenny. Morgan, I was wondering if you could speak a bit about how management for pyrodiversity happens on the landscape.
Yeah. So, and obviously to clarify, I'm not a manager. But we think about how this can happen, and of course how it does happen sometimes is the same and sometimes is different. But in like a really broad theoretical standpoint, like you can manage for pyrodiversity at 3 different points in time. You can manage before fire, you can manage after fire, and you can even manage during fire. And I think right now, we think about most of fire management as very reactive, and I hopefully people are going to nod with me. I mean, there's increasingly we're moving towards over the last 10, certainly over the last 15 years, like I've seen how it's been moving towards more pre-fire management, preparing our landscape for fire. And like Jonathan's talk is exactly a great example of how like we are thinking proactively about preparing landscapes for fire. And what Jonathan talked about through fuel treatments, and then of course also through prescribed fire, is our 2 best metrics or 2 best methods for sort of real pre-fire landscape preparation in ways that prepare biodiversity. Because like what we're thinking about in biodiversity, and I'm really talking about here about like structural variation in fire. Biodiversity can also be temporal variation. So having fires across the landscape that have burned at different times across different years. And so that just means keeping fire active and alive on a landscape at various times. So it's not like all the fires burn in 1 year and then you don't have fires for another 50 years. That's not great for biodiversity either. But thinking spatially about spatial variation of like having patches of low severity next to patches of high severity or mixed severity patchy fires, thinking about how we put prescribed fire back onto landscapes, thinking about how we do mechanical thinning or other types of thinning operations to different parts of the forest so that when a fire does come that we're not controlling, that it results in that heterogeneity that we're looking for on the landscape. Increasingly, certainly with California, with these mega fires, Jonathan just talked about the ones in New Mexico as well 2 years ago, we have these events that there were things get out of control. But there's lots of examples in recent years of mega fires hitting areas where people have been actively managing the landscape, and suddenly the fire changes. It switches from a crown fire to a surface to a ground fire. And that process of switching from a crown fire to a ground fire is actively creating heterogeneity, is actively creating biodiversity. And so while we can go in after fires and try and sort of say, okay, well, this is where we're going to retain, or this is where we're gonna manage for patchiness, pre-fire management is much more effective because it then is resulting in a landscape that is quote unquote natural in terms of the heterogeneity that we find on it. I mean, I'm actually curious to hear, Jonathan, if how you all are thinking about that in your actual active management of creating these corridors.
Yeah, what you said about the fire going from a ground fire to a ground fire is exactly kind of what we're trying to do, and it also gives us an opportunity. This corridor is just the beginning for us and for this property. we want to replicate this in other areas. And so that way we're going to have these zones in between these managed areas where if a fire does start, we maybe let it burn. Maybe we know we have containment now, so maybe we let it burn, and maybe we and I love the concept of pyrodiversity. I mean, what your presentation was just great. I loved hearing all that, and it's going to really inform me in my management going forward. So I appreciate that. So yeah, we're really getting to the point where we want to be able to not only utilize fire in a prescribed fashion as a management tool, but possibly just a wildfire that comes through, being able to use that as well, and achieving some of that biodiversity in a more natural way.
Thank you both. All right, I'm going to give one more opportunity for anyone to come off mute and turn on their camera, either or, and ask us a question here. All right. If not, then I'm going to see if our presenters have any last thoughts that they didn't get to share yet that perhaps they want to share with us all before we close up.
I just wanted to thank everyone again, especially for the survey responses as we go forward with future webinars. So we're really looking forward to get at those learning objectives into the future. And thanks to Morgan and Jonathan for starting us out on this journey.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. It's been a real pleasure to come and share some of our science with you.
Yeah, thank you guys. I really enjoyed that, and what I said there in that discussion with Morgan, I think kind of sums up my feelings about this. So thank you guys.
Thank you all. Thank you all for presenting. And I want to say thanks to all of the attendees today. It's great to have you here. We are starting off today, the beginning of this webinar series. So stay tuned for more. We are already planning, like Jamie mentioned, some monitoring webinars, both habitat and wildlife monitoring. So stay tuned for those announcements. Those will be coming in May, June, and July. And thank you all for your ideas, your thoughts, your conversations. And have a great day and a great week. We'll see you next time.